So our next panel will expand upon Lieutenant Little's presentation regarding the impact on our environment. And we have a panel discussion that will be led by Dr. Nelson. We want to welcome up at this point Sergeant Miyabara with the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, the Marijuana Eradication Team, Mr. Higley, who's a biologist with the Hoopa Tribal Lands, and Ms. West, who's with the providing the water resource perspective from the State Water Resource Control Board.
Thank you. We're very happy to continue our wildlife and environmental discussion. Our county includes beautiful large areas and open areas which have become popular places to grow marijuana. Sergeant Miyabara will talk about land use issues here in our own county, followed by Mr. Higley, who will share his work on land use and wildlife impacts on our Indian reservations and state and national forests. And following Mr. Higley, we will hear from Senior Attorney Yvonne West from the Water Resource Board, and she will discuss the role of marijuana growers and the impact on our very, very limited water supplies in California. Let's begin with Sergeant Miyabara. Sergeant, as the head of the Marijuana Eradication Team, can you describe your work in the county and the impact of cultivation and resource issues in our county here?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm the supervisor for the Santa Clara County Marijuana Eradication Team, also known as MET. And just real briefly, I want to let you know what we do as a team before we get into the meat and potatoes of things. First, our mission is the investigation and eradication of illegal marijuana gardens in our county. To apprehend and prosecute violators, to educate the community. We attend various community events and educate them on the impacts that these marijuana growers have on our communities. And to train law enforcement concerning medical marijuana issues. As you all know, it's an ever-changing landscape, and we work hard to keep our law enforcement officers up to date on the latest trends and laws. Currently, our team is made up of 2 full-time detectives. That's myself and Detective Barker. We also solicit the help of several deputies and sergeants who we've given specialized training to, but mostly help us when we go out and do the eradications, which is where the officer safety issues come in, and so we employ a lot more help to go out and make it safer for everybody. The most important member of our team is a Belgian Malinois who's turning 5 this Halloween. His name is Nas, and he has the most arrests on our team because he's the fastest. And he has actually brought the safety level of our team up tremendously, and has directly been the cause of resolving situations that would have otherwise turned deadly for us. So the type of marijuana gardens that we deal with, the outdoor marijuana gardens. These are the marijuana gardens where the drug trafficking organizations, they run these. These are the trespass groves where they go out into our county parks, state parks, private ranches, and they set up shop, and they live in the gardens for the whole growing season, from springtime until harvest time in late summer or fall. We deal with backyard marijuana gardens, ag field marijuana gardens. Sometimes they're right in the middle of cornfields. The greenhouse marijuana gardens, which Lieutenant Little touched on a lot, we refer to them as greenhouse marijuana gardens. They're not always in greenhouses. This is where the cultivators will buy land, come in and illegally grade it without permits, and set up shop and make a lot of money. And of course, indoor marijuana gardens, where the cultivators will turn a warehouse, business, residences into cultivation operations. But what I'm going to focus on today are the outdoor marijuana gardens. And I'm not an environmental expert. I'm going to leave that to my panel partners to talk about the long-term effects of the damage that these gardens cause. But as many of you have heard about these types of gardens, and I'm going to do my best. My slideshow is it's a whole bunch of pictures, a little light on words, but a lot of pictures. But to try to show you what we see when we go out there. We're the ones who contact the suspects out there, and really the only ones who get to see these gardens are the law enforcement officers who raid them, the cultivators who set them up, and occasionally a news crew or something that comes out. What you're looking at here are 6 trays of seedling marijuana plants. Each tray has 72 plants in them, and this is how they bring them out to the garden. Prior to this, the cultivators will send out scouts to find a good area to grow. They go into the woods, they find a place that's remote, they don't think they're going to get caught, that's close to water. I talked about the type of locations that they choose earlier. But when they get there, they bring their plants in, they start setting up the infrastructure. And after they're out of their seedling phase here, they'll put them in the ground. And it's hard to see in this picture because they're in a more immature stage. This is the growing phase. They're only a foot tall, kind of skinny, not very odorous. So it's a little bit difficult to detect. But you can see in this photograph how they've completely cleared the area out of brush. They've chopped trees down, pulled bushes, they push it all to the edge of the garden, which creates a big wall around it. But it's the impact that they have there of tearing out all the plant life is pretty big. And then later on, in the harvest season, you can see these plants are nice and budded. At this time of year, most of the plant life is dead, while everything else is brown. These well cared for plants are bright green. The environmental impact. So plants need water, and what was discussed earlier about the diversion of streams, we see in these types of gardens, and it's pretty bad. They dig big pools, we call them check dams, big holes in the ground, they line them with plastic, and they use that black poly pipe to divert streams and springs, stock ponds, and reservoirs to fill up their check dams to irrigate their gardens. And you can see the black poly pipe running out there. This is another example where they built a dam directly in a stream. They use dirt, rocks, branches, sometimes they bring in bags of concrete, and they run the poly pipe out there to feed their gardens. And this one here was a 12-foot well that they dug. They kept digging down, and he told us that he kept digging until they found groundwater. And once they hit groundwater, they started siphoning it out to their garden. So when they go out there, the black poly pipe, standard pipe that you can buy in like drip line that you can use for your yards. We work with the Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, which is a DOJ organization that brings a helicopter out and helps us bring all the trash and marijuana out of these gardens. And at the end of August of this year, they sent me a statistic that they had pulled over 307 miles of this poly pipe out of gardens, which is enough to stretch from here to almost LA. Right? So a lot of poly pipe pulled out of the woods. They move into these areas, they build structures. This one here, you can see a ladder leading up to a sleeping area. They've got some shelving in there. This photograph shows a structure that was built above a seedling bed, where they could tie up the seedlings to give them some support. Kitchens. You can see here they have a stove with a propane tank. They've got a little pantry set up there. They often run water lines so that they can use it for cooking and to wash their dishes. This one's a little bit harder to see. Up in the corner, up on the left side there, you can see a tent, and it's purposely hard to see. They camouflage them, they throw leaves and branches on top of them so they're hard to detect from the air. But they live in these gardens, like I said, from spring until harvest time. Now, if you're living in the gardens for that long, it's going to create a lot of trash. Right? This particular picture, they were pretty tidy. They brought garbage bags with them, and they put them all in one spot. It's not always like this. Sometimes they just throw it down the hill. It ends up in the waterways and dry creek beds, which then fill up in the wintertime and flows down. But we've seen all kinds of trash, food trash, car batteries, the propane tanks, everything gets left out there except for the marijuana buds. This is our trailer at the end of an average-sized garden that has trash. You can see all the poly pipe on top, and we make many runs to the dump sites. So part of their job as marijuana tenders is to make sure the plants are protected. So they use insecticides, the pesticides, rodenticides, the nutrients for the plants that they use, the chemicals, and those all end up in the ground. All the containers end up all over the place. This photograph shows that poly pipe that actually has containers hooked up to it in line with the water lines to directly deliver their chemicals to the nutrients to the plants, so it runs right through the lines. And of course, Furadam, which was spoken about earlier, we do see that out there quite a bit, and it causes great precautions for us. I believe it'll probably be spoken about here briefly, and the impact that it has on the wildlife out there, which we have also been witness to. This is the hide of a buck that we found actually earlier this year with the skull nearby. Here you can see one of my partners cutting out from some netting. There's a lizard caught in there. It was one of about a dozen, but this one was still alive, so he was cutting it out to set him free. They use that to protect the plants also, and wildlife gets caught up in them. Air rifles are used out there to keep rodents off of their crops. And when you get bored out there in the woods, sometimes you decide to shoot some birds. So that's a dead blue jay. And that's a bobcat that was poached, and the hide was tied up to a fence. So we see a lot of wildlife out there that's been harmed. The weapons that we've found out there, were all found in our county. Knives, handguns, rifles, shotguns, both automatic and semi-automatic. And just to give you an idea, in our county since 2012, those are some of the statistics. We've eradicated over 415,000 marijuana plants, made 149 arrests, pulled 38 firearms out of these gardens, almost 2,500 pounds of processed marijuana, and 26 tons of trash removed from the woods. And to let you guys know, there's only 2 of us, and we guarantee that a lot of these gardens out there are being harvested that we haven't been able to get to. People often ask us, where are these gardens? And I'll stand them out in the middle, walk outside and say, see all the trees up there, and those hills over there, there's marijuana up there. And it's just really hard to keep up with, and the impact on our environment, as you can see, so it's pretty significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergeant, for sharing what's going on here in our county. Now we'll hear from Mr. Higley, who is the biologist for the Hoopa tribal lands, and he will discuss with us how marijuana cultivation and trespassing affects our forests and our wildlife.
Well, it was nice to see Todd talk about trespass grows, so you have a little bit of an idea what I'm going to talk about. And Dwayne Little earlier talked a lot about the private land, quasi-legal grows. First of all, I'm going to say thank you, Sue, and Patrick for inviting me down. It's an important topic to talk about. I've done this presentation 40 or 50 times now, from Washington, D.C., Florida, Alaska to San Diego. And my colleagues, Rod Gabriel and Greta Wingert, have, whoops, so far advanced, I didn't even think I touched it. Anyway, Dr. Rod Gabriel and Greta Wingert have also been doing these presentations, and we're trying to get the word out as to the impacts of these trespass marijuana grows on our public and tribal lands, not only in California, but in other states as well. It's expanding dramatically. And first thing I need to say is that generally I do 45-minute presentation, and I've cut this down as much as I can, and I'm not going to make the time, and so I'll be watching her, I guess. She's going to be mean to me. And I'll apologize now for not being able to finish what I have to say. Also, I have to thank a bunch of agencies that have helped us do what we've done over the last few years. First of all, the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation is a 12 by 12 mile square located immediately south of the confluence of the Klamath and Trinity Rivers in northeastern Humboldt County. So right in the middle of the big triangle up there, the Emerald Triangle. It's 144 square miles, and I've worked there for most of my professional career, last 25 years. It's located within the Klamath watershed entirely, and primarily within the Trinity portion of the Klamath watershed. And I've done all of my work where I've gone in trespass grows within the Trinity watershed. Other members of our team have gone all over the place with camp teams in Northern California. Today I'm going to talk about fishers, spotted and barred owls, and black bears a little bit, if I have time to get to all of this. And tell you how wildlife biologists got involved with marijuana at all. And to illustrate that, the fisher, which has been a candidate for listing as a threatened species from 2004 through 2014, when it then was proposed to be listed as threatened at the federal level, and then declined for listing in spring in 2016, is a species of conservation concern, whether or not it got listed or not. And I've been studying fishers for most of my 25-year career at Hoopa, because they're also a culturally important animal. So what I'm going to do is walk through how we got involved with marijuana in the first place. We've been doing demographic studies of fishers from 2005 through present at Hoopa, where we capture and mark a number of animals every year, every animal within a density study area. And we put radio collars on a fairly large percentage of them, so 20 to 35 animals a year. And then we try to monitor, well, first we release them at the site of capture, and then try to monitor whether or not they're alive or dead every week, and get locations on them for habitat use studies and study reproduction and things like that. But primarily what we're trying to do is look at the demographic parameters of these species. And one of those things is looking at the causes of mortality. Anyway, biology is complicated, and you don't always see things clearly. In this particular case, we have a male fisher who is now going to pee on the lens of the camera that we have set to monitor a female fisher's den site. And so that's just one reason that we may not see things clearly. Dr. Rod Gabriel wanted to know really what was causing the mortality of fishers, and so he convinced a number of studies areas, mine included, and 2 in the southern Sierras, to provide the carcasses that we found in conducting our study to have full necropsies done at UC Davis. And in a full necropsy, there's tissues that are sampled and looked at with microscope, and then they're archived. So there's a bucket of tissue samples there from this particular necropsy that's going on. And hopefully the board-certified pathologist can determine the cause of mortality. They don't always, even at that stage, but in 2009, our first anticoagulant rodenticide of a fisher occurred. So a fisher that was killed by an anticoagulant rodenticide or a rat poison. These animals live out in the forest and spend their entire life living in areas that don't generally overlap any human inhabitation, and yet one died from rat poison. So we thought, well, how could that happen? And so we went back to those archived tissue samples, and we found that 46 of 58 fishers across 3 study areas from Northern California to the Southern Sierras were exposed to rat poison. That's 79% of fishers, wild, free-ranging fishers out in an area where there should not be any poisons. And then we talked to people like Todd here and found out that, oh yeah, there's rat poisons at all those trespass grow sites. And we also had 4 direct mortalities, and published the results in a journal called PLOS One. And at that point in 2012, when we published that article, it was kind of a groundbreaking article where it showed that trespass marijuana growing was directly linked to the impact to a candidate species of wildlife that was a candidate for listing as threatened species. So that didn't stop Murad and I from wondering what we might be able to do to document how bad this problem might be. And so in 2012, we started accompanying teams, camp teams in particular, Camp Team 1, and going into grow sites with them. These are photos I took in 2013 from 10 different grow sites in the Trinity watershed, rodenticides all 10 of them. And of course, fishers could be exposed to this poison a variety of ways. First of all, they're an opportunistic forager, so they'll eat almost anything. And try to get all the arrows out here. So they could potentially be eating the baits directly because they're flavorized. So this one's fish flavored. They can eat prey that's already consumed their poison, and so it's basically a walking toxic pill. They don't die for 5 to 10 days after ingesting a lethal dose. Or they can eat the dead animals that would occur as well. And so exposure to a fisher is multifaceted, and other species of wildlife as well. So any other carnivore out there that might eat rodents. This shows that 9 of 13 fishers were exposed to rodenticide in my study area at Hoopa prior to publishing the results in the PLOS paper. And then since then, we've had 15 of 20 animals, so the percentage has increased on my study area up to 75%. And we've had an additional 5 direct mortalities, and altogether now we're up to 7 direct mortalities of fishers. And for the male portion of our population of fishers, toxicosis or poisoning is a very important aspect of how they're dying. And not only that, predation, which is almost 50% of the mortality at this point in time, can be exacerbated by the poisons. And this is animal 254. He's a large male fisher in this May of 2012, and he's succumbing to poison. And you're not supposed to be able to actually walk out in the woods and pick up a fisher, but this guy was dying. And then before euthanizing him, I had assessed him by bringing him back into the office, turning him loose. And you can imagine a fisher doing that on the ground would be easy prey for a bobcat or a mountain lion. And so predation, which occurs on my study area primarily in May and June, may be affected quite a bit by exposure to these poisons. That's a hard thing to prove, but it's certainly a likelihood. Dwayne Little used this photo in his presentation, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit. These are not the grows I'm talking about. These are the quasi-legal 215 grows. I think they're estimated like $1 billion worth of pot growing in that one spot. What I'm talking about are these trespass grows. They're hidden away in the forest, across our national forests, national parks, wilderness areas, tribal lands, and private timberlands. They're generally very difficult to see. They use helicopters to spot them, and then the camp teams go in and try to eradicate them. By their own estimation, they only eradicate 15 to 50% of them a year, but nobody really knows how many are actually out there. But I often think, well, I'm just Chicken Littles, and basically crying the sky is falling. However, when you look at 79, and now at this point in time, 85% of fishers are exposed to rodenticide, it must mean that there's an awful lot of those grow sites out on our landscape in order to poison or at least expose that many or that high percentage of our animals to that. And that's just one species that we're looking at. So it wouldn't matter if it was corn or squash or strawberries or cilantro. I've seen all these things planted at grow sites. What they're doing, basically, these criminals are trespassing on our public lands, cultivating in riparian protection zones, areas set aside for resource protection. They're diverting water at a tremendous rate, often 100% diversion of the water from headwater streams. And just as a small example, this is the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation with the red dots representing trespass grow sites, drug trafficking organizations, type of grows, 5,000 plants or more at each of these grows, up to in this case up to 40,000 plants in a single grow site. And that's just Hoopa. And you can extrapolate that across the entire forested region of California. And we actually have data that we've used to model grow site locations that shows very wide distribution of those grow sites. So what do they look like? Well, at the point when I started looking at them, they look something like this. There's 8 plots in this 26,600 plant grow site and deep down in Mill Creek at Hoopa. And the plots are scattered out for almost a mile of creek frontage. They're buried deep in the forest. They're 1,000 feet elevation below the closest drivable road and more than a half mile from the nearest drivable road. And you can see there's 3 water sources up there. They're draining the water out of headwater streams to water the plants and transferring it in that black plastic pipe up to 2 miles we've seen, and I've heard that even further in some cases. So tremendous amount of effort going into growing in these conditions out there. I'll just go through some slides that show what it looks like on the ground. Lots of erosion. And then, as I mentioned, the diversion of water. Sometimes they'll build tanks with tarps and logs or dig ponds, and 100% diversion of headwater springs and streams. And then from that, draw the water out to the plants using a drip system. So we have drip lines going through there, and then drip lines going to every planting hole. Every planting hole has anywhere from 1 to 6 plants in it. And then they're not growing in the most ideal conditions, obviously. So you can imagine that these plants actually require way more water than if you were growing on good ag land somewhere. They're essentially doing it hydroponically, putting the plants in the ground with a bunch of rock and then pumping chemical fertilizers to them, tons of chemical fertilizers, literally. And what we do when we go into these sites is we document the pounds of fertilizer bags that are out there, and generally it averages over 2,000 pounds of empty chemical fertilizer. And that might look something like that. This is a grow at Hoopa this year of 13,000 plants that was eradicated, and we found our first carbofuran at Hoopa in that grow site. Often the grow sites are shaded. They're planted under partial canopy to hide the plants. So they're not picking places to grow the best plants, but they're growing a lot of them. And for example, this camp was from a site, you can see all the planting trays here. They eradicated this in 2013, and there were 40,000 plants at that site. And they were planning to come back and use that site again and again. 2012 photos showed that grow was there. And then since it was eradicated in 2013, it was never cleaned up. It was active again in 2015. Some items from a camp, lots of food items, and with people comes garbage. You might note in this particular picture, there's a Valentine's bear on top of the dump. I've seen evidence of Valentine's Day at multiple grow sites. I thought it was a fluke at first, but these guys are getting out there often in February. They're spending anywhere from 4 to 8 months in the woods. And with that, there becomes a lot of garbage. And they're not careful with it. A lot of times they throw it right in the stream. That big dump was within a couple meters of a domestic water source. So this is a video clip that shows lifting out an officer and Dr. Gabriel from the grow site that was in the Trinity Alps Wilderness area, and camp team visited 8 different grows up in that area this year, anywhere from 3.5 to 6 miles from the nearest trailhead, not just road. And then they're not near the trail, so the whole point of this is look at the terrain. Are we supposed to be doing agriculture out in a place that looks like that? I don't think so. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and talk about spotted owls and barred owls. This is a northern spotted owl, threatened species since 1990. and a species I've studied intensively for over 20 years. The spotted owl is being outcompeted by the barred owl throughout its range, in northern, at least the northern spotted owl. And on the left, there's a pair of spotted owls. I used to have 35 pairs of spotted owls at Hoopa, and now we have 10. Barred owls are outcompeting them dramatically. The Fish and Wildlife Service is implementing a experimental barred owl removal, and we do that using a shotgun. So we've removed 207 barred owls from Hoopa over the last 3 years, and with that, we're testing all the liver samples that we get from barred owls. And they're exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides at 62% the first 2 years and 71% this year. And anecdotally, we have 8 spotted owls that were roadkill, and 5 of those exposed to rodenticides. So I'm almost out of time, and I was going to get to the important stuff here, the carbofuran, and do the video again if you could. One of the reasons that they're using these really toxic chemicals that are banned in the U.S., they're actually manufactured in Pennsylvania, shipped all over the world, and then come back to our area. Bears are a nuisance in these grow sites. There's enough carbofuran in that bottle to kill 750 of that bear right there. That's a lot of toxicity. And the law enforcement guys are potentially exposed to this stuff. It gets absorbed through your skin, it absorbed through your lungs anyway, and it's a powerful neurotoxin with no reversal. They're mixing it with food items and setting it out and killing bears quite a lot. And this is just showing one carcass I dug up. It has a bullet hole through the top of the head. Teeth were sawed off, and then it was buried. We swabbed the cranium and got carbofuran out of that, and the tuna can that was next to it. And that was the second bear we found that day. With that, I'm going to sit down because we've got other speakers, and I'm only like 2/3 of the way through my presentation.
Thank you so much, Mr. Higley. We'll now hear from lead attorney Ms. West from the Water Resource Board and her water source perspective on how the proliferation of grows has impacted our state and what the state's doing to address this.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you for having me today and giving me an opportunity to talk to you. Try not to be too loud. My name is Yvonne West. As I said, I'm the lead attorney for the State Water Resources Control Board Office of Enforcement, Cannabis Enforcement and Regulation Unit. I work closely with Lieutenant Little, who was up here earlier, in a joint task force between the water boards and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to address some of the impacts that we're seeing from cannabis cultivation. You'll see my presentation is entitled A Growing Threat to California's Water, pun intended. I'm a relatively newcomer to the cannabis enforcement realm. The task force was formed in 2014, but I quickly came to realize that I would be known as the pot attorney, and so I figured I would just embrace all the bad jokes that were going to be coming my way, and now just try to work them into my presentations. I wanted to take a few minutes to give a quick background on what the unit is and what our role is, and how we interface with some of the other agencies you've heard from here today. The Cannabis Enforcement and Regulation Unit at the water boards works closely, as I said, with the Department of Fish and Wildlife as part of a task force. This task force was initially authorized in 2014 as a pilot project. When the legislature approved the governor's budget that allocated a small number of positions on a temporary basis and directed the water boards to improve the prevention of illegal stream diversions, discharges of pollutants into waterways, and other water quality impacts associated with cultivation. The same legislation directed Fish and Wildlife to investigate and enforce violations of illegal stream bed alteration and the Endangered Species Act associated with marijuana production. That's a little broader than what the task force actually does. As Mark alluded to, we don't focus on the trespass grows that Mark was discussing in detail. We focus our administrative and regulatory authorities on what you can call quasi-legal or legal grows. The Water Board is not a law enforcement entity, and that's why we rely heavily on our partners, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, to enable us to get out to these sites and to look into what's going on in those sites. But we're going to be most effective on the grows that are occurring on a private property that are still having impacts, that are quasi-illegal or attempting to become illegal, that are growing medical marijuana or alleging to grow medical marijuana. The Water Board's taking a neutral stance. We don't evaluate whether or not it's a legitimate medical grow or not. We're focusing mainly on the discharges to waters of the state and the diversions from these grows to assess or to address the impacts that we're seeing. Our limited resources were initially focused on North Highway 20. In Northern California, where we felt most of the cultivation was taking place, most of the cultivation pressure that was impacting species was taking place, the most intense areas of impact, because again, we're very limited resources. My role in the task force as the lead enforcement attorney for the water boards is to represent both the regional water board and the state water board on enforcement actions associated with these impacts. I just wanted to provide a brief overview. Hopefully I'll be able to skip a lot of my presentation, or at least a few slides of my presentation, because the impacts have already been covered pretty thoroughly. But the water boards here in California have an administrative authority to regulate water quality and water rights issues, and we have enforcement authority in both those realms. The state water board specifically is a 5-member board that protects water quality by setting statewide policy and coordinating and supporting the regional water quality board's efforts in relation to water quality. And they are also solely responsible for allocating surface water rights. So you might have heard more about the state board recently with the drought. We've been in the news a lot because of the scarcity of water availability lately. The regional board, who we also represent, we have 9 regional boards in California. You can see some of the boundaries outlined here on this map. These 9 boards are semi-autonomous, and they're comprised of 7 board members appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. These regional boundaries are based on watersheds and water quality requirements and the unique differences in climate, topography, geography, and hydrology in each of these watersheds. As I mentioned earlier, our pilot project focused mainly in Region 1 on the north coast and the top of Region 5 you see on this map. Since the pilot project took effect, the Medical Marijuana Safety Act was adopted, and it directed our program to go statewide, or authorized our program statewide, and we're working on doing that as the resources become available. Our task force inspections of cultivation sites generally include technical staff from both the state and the regional water board, as well as California Department of Fish and Wildlife. This allows us to address water quality, water rights, and species concerns on these sites, on each site, as we go out and inspect them. Lieutenant Little already covered, and Matt covered, and our other speakers on the panel have covered in depth a lot of the impacts that we see on these sites. We're seeing the similar or same impacts from private grows on private property. Luckily, I'll have to say, I don't think we're seeing as much of the rodenticide. We're not seeing as much of the insecticide, rodenticide, pesticides, but they're still out there. Tons of housekeeping issues, you can see by the photo in the upper right. Sanitary issues are a lot of concern. Human waste going into our surface waters is a big concern. We're seeing it on a lot of sites. But mostly, as Lieutenant Little alluded to, the development of these sites is what's causing a lot of problems. We've got sedimentation issues and erosion issues associated with the unauthorized development of these sites in these formerly pristine areas. where these parties aren't obtaining grading permits or using engineers or consultants. So in the upper left, you'll see a huge grow pad that was constructed on a formerly forested area. And this larger photo to the right is the side of that grow pad. And you can see from the rilling in that, just the amount of sediment that was coming off that grow pad and into the local waterways. The lower left, you see we had a culvert blowout. So basically that road was one of those roads that Lieutenant Little was referencing. It was constructed poorly and blew out, causing all that discharge downstream. We're also concerned with the unauthorized water use that many of the speakers referenced and talked about. Fortunately, the State Water Board and the regional water boards have administrative civil liability authority, and when we have a responsible property owner, we can hold them responsible for these types of violations and for cleaning up the conditions on their property. Just generally to quantify what we're seeing out there, looking at last year's inspections, we estimate that approximately 75% of those sites had some type of water quality violation, with 1/3 of those being what we would consider more serious violations. The more difficult problem that we're faced with is how to quantify and address impacts from the cumulative impacts of these large number of existing and new cultivation sites, especially when those sites are constructed in small watersheds in areas that were formerly undeveloped and in sensitive habitats. This is a screenshot of a computer program that was developed as part of our task force in the first year. It's called our Cannabis Identification and Prioritization System. And we're often asked about how many grows are out there, what are the size of the grows, how much water use, what is the scale of the environmental impact that we're talking about. And we're just beginning to really get to the place where we can quantify it. You'll see on this screenshot that it's focused, again, just in that task force area, because the initial contract for this program was only covered 20,000 square kilometers that were mapped. And in mapping that 20,000 square kilometers, we came up with, you see the numbers to the right on the slide, approximately 19,000 grows just in this Northern California area. And not even the full area being mapped. It was, 18% of that area was mapped, and we came up with 20,000 grows. So if we extrapolate that number out, we can estimate that there's over 50,000 grows in Northern California alone. We don't have the same level of information for the rest of the state, but we are working on expanding our project and our program and this as the resources become available. Without specific information on the rest of the state, we're relying a lot on local agencies to tell us what's going on in other areas. And we're seeing, as Lieutenant Little referenced, a bit of a green rush is still going on. The number and locations of cultivation sites is very dynamic, and it's very reactive to the changing legal landscape in California. A lot of local agencies and governments are now considering cannabis ordinances, new ordinances in response to the Medical Marijuana Safety Act. Some communities have legalized commercial grow, and for example, in Calaveras County, recently adopted a commercial cultivation ordinance, and we saw over 1,000 new applications in the first half of 2016 alone. We've got estimates from Santa Cruz Sheriff's Office that they believe they have over 5,000 grows in Santa Cruz County alone. And then, as some of the other speakers have shown you the same imagery, we see explosive growth in areas that we've watched over a number of years. This is the Post Mountain slide, again in Trinity County, that Lieutenant Little was referencing and showed you earlier. We see a dramatic increase in 2012, and then we updated this imagery more recently, and in 2016, it looks like it's doubled again. I wanted to end on a little bit of a positive note and look at some of the accomplishments. Dwayne already covered a lot of these accomplishments on this slide. The inspections that we've done, we've developed regulatory programs in Region 1 and Region 5 for these 215 grows, can come and file notices of intent and adhere to specific conditions and terms in their growing to prevent these types of impacts and waste discharge impacts. We've also brought a number of enforcement cases in the last 2 years in front of the regional boards and the state board, imposing liability for some of the poor development that we've seen and some of the water quality effects and water rights violations. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I'm out of time. One of the ones was a bulk water hauling case where during the drought we had a bulk water hauler taking water out of a curtailed stream that was already taxed, and there were no flows available for other legal water rights holders, and they were trucking it off to cultivation sites. Our next steps, as we've discussed in previous presentations, is the state is moving forward to adopt a statewide waste discharge order to regulate cultivation, legal cultivation of medical marijuana in the state, and impose conditions and terms to avoid the types of impacts we're currently seeing. The Division of Water Rights is in the process of developing interim in-stream flow requirements for the North Coast area, which is heavily impacted, in hopes of avoiding continued impacts to those surface streams. As we move forward, we're going to be continuing to outreach to growers and educate them about these impacts so that the quasi-legal or attempting to become legal cultivators can be educated and understand what these impacts are having and how to avoid them, so we can get as much voluntary compliance as possible, and then we will of course continue with inspections and enforcement as necessary. That's it.
Thank you, Yvonne. We have time for just 1 or 2 questions. We already have one question up here if you'd like to answer that.
So the question is, what is the street value of a 5,000 plant marijuana grow? And I would say I need more information. A lot of it depends on, there's several factors. One of them would be the ability of the cultivator. If you're absolutely terrible, you may get nothing or just a few grams to a couple ounces. And just recently we did an eradication, and the cultivator told us he was expecting 5 pounds per plant. So depending on that, plus the strain of marijuana that they're growing, which there are countless numbers of strains, and they're all very professional, medicinal names like strawberry cheesecake and Gorilla Glue, Chernobyl, all things that sound like they're good for my health. But if you take 5,000 plants and say you can get 1,000 or 1 pound per plant, which is reasonable for an outdoor grow, and you're getting you can sell it for $2,000 a pound. You're looking at $10 million off of that. But it's kind of like Costco. The more you buy, the cheaper the price. So it can fluctuate anywhere from there, or it can be worth a lot more if you have a very high demand strain.
Okay, Sergeant Miyabara, we'll help you answer this next question.
In Trinity County, 2 of our law enforcement canines have been stabbed in the neck and face while pursuing suspects in Mexican cartel grows. Have you found this to be a new tactic by suspects? We've also seen the announcements for those tragic incidents come out, and we take as many precautions as we can with our canines, especially in light of those incidents, where we take a lot more time watching the suspects if we have the opportunity to before contacting them to try to determine if they're armed. But it's sometimes there's nothing you can do, and that's the canines are there to keep us all safe, and it's not something none of our canines down here have been stabbed yet, but it's something that we're very aware of and we're keeping an eye on, but really tragic.
Thank you, Dan. I want to thank our panel. Thank you all for being here.